Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep, unvarnished look at an issue that literally spans centuries and continents. We're talking about the anatomy of the global wealth divide. Now, whether you're a longtime student of economic theory or you're just trying to wrap your head around the financial forces shaping your everyday life, stick around. We're going to explain everything in detail, unpacking the history, the raw data, and the real-world facts behind economic injustice together. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the journey. First, what is economic injustice? Second, the current global divide. Third, drivers of the wealth gap. Fourth, impacts on global society. Fifth, criticisms of disparity. And finally, number 6, proposals for closing gaps. So, Section 1. What is economic injustice? Let's define the divide. To truly understand the staggering data we're about to look at, we absolutely need a clear, objective baseline. At its core, global economic injustice is the difference in measures of economic well-being between individuals, population groups, or even entire countries. It's deeply tied to both equality of outcomes and equality of opportunity. But you know what's really fascinating? If we look back historically, for a very long time, the unequal distribution of wealth wasn't even considered wrong. It was just widely accepted as the natural order of things. Let's quickly trace how that mindset evolved. Back in the 15th century, Matteo Palmieri actually argued that the rich simply had more money because, well, they were more talented. Simple as that. Fast forward to the early 19th century, and Karl Marx formulates a mathematical theory directly questioning this fairness, focusing instead on worker exploitation. Later that same century, Vilfredo Pareto noticed a rigid structure in Italy, the now famous 80-20 rule, where 80% of the land was owned by just 20% of the population. Then, in 1955, Simon Kuznets introduced some much-needed optimism. He theorized that as wealthy societies grow, inequality naturally declines. But, as we're about to see, that optimistic curve totally crashed and burned by the late 1970s when disparity sharply spiked again. That brings us to Section 2, the current global divide, and some staggering modern statistics. Moving into the modern era, contemporary economist Thomas Piketty argues that rising inequality is basically an inevitable feature of free market capitalism, specifically whenever the return on capital exceeds overall economic growth. And this brilliantly illustrates what we see in the data since the 1980s. There's been a massive internal divergence within countries. Check this out. The richest 1% of the world's population saw their income shoot up by 27%, while the poorest 50% saw only 13% of total income growth. Now, there's a real paradox here. While inequality within individual countries grew, the global gap between rich and poor countries actually shrank, mainly thanks to explosive economic growth in massive nations like China and India. But when we zoom back out to look at global wealth concentration, the numbers are just sobering. According to Oxfam, by early 2016, the 62 richest people on the planet held the exact same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the entire global population. Think about that for a second. 62 people versus over 3.6 billion people. To put that trajectory into perspective, from 2010 to 2016, that bottom half actually lost over $1 trillion in wealth. Meanwhile, those top 62 individuals, they gained $1.76 trillion. And then came the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Oxfam's 2021 report highlighted a number that is just hard to fathom: $3.9 trillion. That massive figure is how much billionaire wealth increased globally during the pandemic. They recovered the absolute quickest. But simultaneously, an estimated 500 million people were likely pushed into living on less than $5.50 a day. It's a tale of two entirely different realities. Which leads us to Section 3, drivers of the wealth gap. Let's unpack the causes. So, what is actually fueling all of this? Because we promised to explain everything in detail, we're going to categorize a massive list of drivers into two main buckets. Let's start with the systemic and economic bucket. Worldwide, we've seen a major reduction in progressive taxes. In fact, Oxfam points to tax evasion through offshore companies as the #1 reason for the growth of inequality since 2010. We also see rampant monopolization. It's really interesting how economists like James Furman and Peter Orszag connect this not just to individuals, but to inequality between different firms rather than just within them. Adding globalization, totally shifting wage dynamics, plus weak corporate governance that basically allows for unlimited executive pay, and well, the economic bucket is overflowing. Then, we have the social and labor causes compounding the issue. Trade unions have seriously weakened over the decades. On top of that, technological demands are vastly outstripping our education systems, meaning wages for highly skilled labor have absolutely skyrocketed. And then there's this fascinating piece of OECD data regarding social status preference. Essentially, people are increasingly marrying within their own income brackets. Currently, 40% of couples marry within the same or adjacent income deciles, up from 33% a couple of decades ago. Plus, single adult households have risen from 15% to 20%. And finally, there's the age-old intergenerational wealth transfer, guaranteeing that wealth begets wealth, while poverty, unfortunately, is also inherited. Section 4. Impacts on global society. The ripple effects. So the crucial point is that the consequences of these drivers ripple out far beyond just individual bank account balances. The human and social cost is severe. High inequality leads to decreased social mobility, a concept economists playfully but grimly call the Great Gatsby curve. It means it's much harder to climb the economic ladder. Economist Raj Chetty's Lost Einsteins report brilliantly shows how this directly restricts societal innovation. Furthermore, studies consistently show poverty negatively impacts child brain development. And economist Morgan Kelly analyzed U.S. data and found a proven, undeniable link between disparity and violent crime. Across the board, higher inequality correlates with lower life expectancy. And on a macroeconomical level, the toll is equally destabilizing. The ultra-rich typically save 75 to 85% of their income. This massive global oversupply of savings leads to lower interest rates, which fundamentally limits what central banks can actually do during a crisis. Meanwhile, the income gap is literally forcing the middle class into exorbitant debt just to afford the basics, like buying a house in an area with good schools. By 2011, the IMF concluded that extreme inequality causes a long-term decline in economic growth. Oh, and it even exacerbates environmental degradation, since highly unequal countries tend to have much higher pollution levels.
Now for Section 5, Criticisms of Disparity Narratives, the Counter Perspective.
To fully understand this issue without bias, we absolutely must examine the opposing economic viewpoints with equal weight. So, on one side, you have the Piketty and Oxfam perspective. They view inequality as a systemic failure, a destructive flaw that desperately requires intervention. But on the other side, critics view disparity through the innovation driver narrative. In this view, economic disparity isn't a bug. It's a feature. It's seen as a necessary incentive that pushes people to take risks, learn useful skills, and drive the very growth that advances society as a whole. This counter-perspective essentially argues, and I'll quote directly here, in market economies where rewards are directly correlated with individual economic contributions, economic disparity is a reasonable and natural result. Now, some of these critics actually argue that economic inequality hasn't increased as much as reported. It is worth noting, just as a matter of fact, that many of these critics are associated with think tanks funded by corporate interests. But understanding this counter-argument is absolutely essential to grasping the whole picture. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 6, Proposals for Closing Gaps, the Potential Remedies. So, what do the experts say we can actually do about this? Economists generally suggest a highly structured, three-pronged approach for solving global economic injustice. Step 1, restrict the super-rich. Step 2, increase the incomes of the poor. And Step 3, deconcentrate capital to democratize wealth ownership. What does this look like in the real world? Well, economists like Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty recommend returning to the high top tax rates of the early 20th century. We're talking between 50 and 90%. They also push hard for ending offshore tax havens and strictly enforcing antitrust laws. For the poor, the remedies include raising the minimum wage and expanding public education. There's also a major call to reduce indirect taxes, like sales taxes. Actually, fun historical fact. Philosopher John Stuart Mill warned way back in the 19th century that indirect taxes unfairly punish the working class. Finally, to deconcentrate capital, economists propose giving workers tax incentives to own stock in the companies they work for, allowing them to ride the same compounding benefits currently enjoyed by the wealthy. Which brings us to the ultimate provocative question we have to leave you with today. Does the pursuit of market innovation inherently require the sacrifice of economic equality? Or can we actually engineer a system that rewards both? Global economic injustice is an ancient problem, but it's persisting and evolving right up to this very second. The data is clear, the impacts are profound, and the proposed remedies are out there on the table. What we do next with this information will define the global economy of the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll catch you next time.